What's up guys, Jake with barbend.com. Today we're going to talk about the one thing, in my opinion, that most trainees are getting wrong in the conventional and sumo deadlift, and that is pulling the slack out of the bar. In this video, we're going to talk about how to do so for both the conventional and sumo deadlift, and we're also going to talk about why it's so crucial for your overall progress in this movement. So before we dive into the methods of pulling the slack out of the bar for the sumo and conventional deadlift, it's a good idea to cover exactly what that means. So when pulling near maximal loads for both of these deadlifts, one of the toughest parts of the movements is simply breaking the floor. And what that means is basically that first percentage of pulling that barbell off the ground. That's often the toughest for people. And I think there's a very fine line between one's overall setup and the efficacy of how they're creating tension in their body in relation to the barbell versus just a straight up strength deficit. So in this video, we're going to talk about the first portion, aka the tension we're creating with our bodies, with the floor and the barbell, and we're going to talk about how to do so efficiently. Your setup is going to be a culmination of how you're pulling the slack out of the bar, and every little detail and joint matters. So now let's kick it into the conventional deadlift. So now let's chat pulling the slack out of the bar for the conventional deadlift. If you've previously thought that that's simply just pulling up on the bar and creating tension, you're not wrong in that way of thinking, but everything kind of works together, and I think that's a little bit limiting, especially when you get to heavier weight. An efficient deadlift is like a chain of commands. So for this example and how we're going to break it down is I'm going to split the body into 4 different areas. We're going to talk about the ankles, we're going to talk about the hips, the lats, and the torso. So now what does that look like in practice? So when I'm getting set up, I'm going to think about screwing my feet into the floor. That's going to put our hips in a slight external rotation, and it's going to create that tension going through my legs. When I bend down and hinge, I'm going to set the back and push my hips backwards, so that's going to create that nice tension through the hips. We already have tension in our legs, and now we're creating that in our hips. When we bend down and grab the bar, now that we have a strong hip hinge, our ankles are nice and set, our feet are screwed in the floor, we're going to pull those lats back. We're going to put those scapula in the back pocket, and that's going to pull that bar into us. So now that the bar is pulled into us, we're going to think about taking a nice big belly breath and putting that tension into the bar. So basically, our chain is now primed and ready to go. It's not just us simply bending down and lifting up and creating tension, it's creating tension throughout the full body through the floor. So versus if we just set, create a little tension, and then pull. So now that we discussed pulling the slack out of the bar in the conventional deadlift, let's talk about a couple mental cues you can keep in mind when pulling multiple reps. When pulling the slack out of the bar and pulling singles, it's a little bit easier to do, but when you're pulling multiple reps, your thought process has to be a little bit quicker in between because you have to get set and pull before you kind of lose that momentum in the set. So here are 3 things that I like to keep in mind for pulling multiple reps in the conventional deadlift. Now everybody will be slightly different, but these are 3 that you can try if you're kind of losing that thought process in between reps and you're losing tension. So every rep, we're back on the ground. I think bar into me, I think scaps in my back pocket, and then big belly breath. So bar into me, scaps in the back pocket, belly breath. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna create that tension throughout the full body. The bar into me kind of pulls the bar back and kind of makes me screw my feet in, engage my hips. The scaps in the back pocket engage the lats. And then obviously that big belly breath is keeping my torso at that relatively neutral positioning to create a strong pull. So now let's chat on pulling the slack out of the bar for the sumo deadlift. So whether you just prefer to pull sumo or you compete with sumo, there are a couple different ways to pull the slack out of the bar that are a little bit different than the conventional deadlift. Obviously the concept is the same, but the sumo is a lot more technical in terms of just your overall pulling mechanics, and that's gonna create subtle differences in how you're gonna have to set and pull the slack out. So let's talk about the ankles similar to how we did in the conventional deadlift. So similar to the conventional deadlift, I'm gonna think about screwing my feet into the floor. That's gonna put my hips, again, in a slight external rotation, and it's gonna allow me to get tight throughout my legs. Now, when I bend down and I hinge at the hip, it's gonna be more of a, you're pulling your hips back and that bar into you. So it's almost like you're sitting your hips down and into the bar. And now obviously everybody's hips will have a slightly different angle based off of your anthropometrics. So for me, I might look a little bit different than you, but what I'm thinking about is while my feet are screwed into the floor, my hips are down and tight and they're not too far up to where I'm gonna have to pull mostly back when breaking the floor. Now let's talk about the lats. This is the second part that's gonna be different than the conventional deadlift. In the sumo deadlift, the lats need to stay packed the whole time, so there has to be a huge emphasis on how we're packing those lats at the beginning of the movement. Since we're sitting a little bit lower, we need to really focus on pulling them back, because if they're loose, that's gonna shoot our hips up, and it's gonna pretty much break down all the technical efficiency that comes along with the sumo deadlift. So now that we've screwed our feet into the floor, our hips are tight, our lats are back, we're gonna take that nice big belly breath and complete the movement. So again, same 4 areas of where we're gonna pay attention to create tension with, but the hips and lats tend to be a lot more important with how technical sumo deadlifts tend to be. All right, so now let's chat on some tips for pulling the slack out of the bar for the sumo deadlift. The concept is the same as the conventional deadlift, and obviously all of it is very important, but how do you get set in between multiple reps can be make or break with the sumo deadlift, because it is highly technical and it's a movement that's pretty prone to losing balance in. So let's get set as we normally would, and I'm gonna go ahead and pull a rep as if we're doing a multiple rep set. And so now the sequencing of how we're gonna set. As opposed to pulling that bar into us first, with the sumo deadlift, I like to think hips first, because that hip is then gonna wedge us down behind the bar, and then we're gonna think about pulling the bar in. So we're gonna think hips, bar, and then we're gonna think about lats back for the pull. So again, hips down, wedge us in, the bar is gonna pull into it, so we're gonna pull those lats back, and complete the second, the third, the fourth, to maybe 5th rep. So no matter what fitness level you're at, I think pulling the slack out of the bar is a skill that should be continually fine-tuned for improvement in both the sumo and conventional deadlift. It can be make or break in singles, it can ensure that you're moving efficiently in multiple rep sets, and you can even use it as an indicator for areas in the body that might be a little bit tight or lagging the day of your deadlift set. So if you're setting weird and you notice that you can't get into position based off the cues you have, that could be somewhere that you need to spend a little bit more attention to before getting to your heavier lifts. If you want to read more on this topic and learn more about pulling the slack out of the bar, make sure to Google our article and search BarBend and pulling the slack out of the bar.